The wind rattled the windows as if trying to force its way in, and inside the old house, calloused hands adjusted the last ornaments on the Christmas tree, while the aroma of baked ham filled every corner. It was Christmas Eve, and anticipation hung heavy in the air, thick like the silence that would follow. No one knew yet that this night would change everything, that the words spoken here would echo for days, that abandonment would come with a price and a purpose no one imagined. Before we delve into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the old wooden walls. The old man held a golden star between his fingers, balancing on his tiptoes to reach the top of the tree. His back ached, as it always did at the end of the day, but he didn't complain, never complained. The old woman passed behind him, carrying a steaming platter, her apron stained with sauce, her hair pulled back in a loose bun that was already unraveling. She looked at her husband and smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Be careful not to fall, you stubborn old goat." He grumbled something but smiled too. 52 years of marriage did that, transformed scolding into affection, silence into conversation. The house wasn't large, but it was theirs. Every crack in the wall, every warped floorboard, every creaking door, everything there had a story. And on that night, the whole house seemed to breathe along with them, waiting for their 6 grandchildren. They would come as they always did, noisy, hurried, full of stories from the big city, bringing gifts wrapped in shiny paper, quick hugs, kisses on the cheek that barely touched the skin. The old woman set the table for the 3rd time. She adjusted the napkins, checked the silverware, lit the candles. Everything had to be perfect. Not that they would notice, they never did, but she needed to do it. It was her way of saying, "You are welcome here, you are loved here." The old man slowly stepped down from the chair, holding his back. He looked at the tree and nodded, satisfied. The tiny lights blinked in. A disordered sequence, some ornaments were crooked, but it looked beautiful. It was ready. He turned to his wife and saw in her that expression he knew so well. The mix of joy and anxiety, that desire for everything to go well, for the grandchildren to stay, for the family to be like it used to be, but it wasn't like it used to be. Not anymore. The hours passed slowly. 8 o'clock turned into 9. The food grew cold on the table. The old woman looked at the clock on the wall every 5 minutes, its ticking marking time. Like a condemnation, the old man sat in the worn leather armchair, his hands clasped on his lap, his gaze fixed on the door. Waiting, always waiting. When they finally knocked, it was past 10. The old woman jumped up, smoothing her apron, adjusting her hair. The old man rose more slowly, his spine protesting. But they smiled. They smiled because it was Christmas, because it was their grandchildren, because there was still hope that this night would be different. The door opened, and the cold night air invaded the room along with them. 6 figures rushed in, talking loudly, laughing that forced laugh the old woman knew so well. Their leader, the oldest, came first. Tall, with a trimmed beard, an expensive leather jacket. He kissed his grandmother on the cheek without looking into her eyes, squeezed his grandfather's hand too hard. The others followed, a wave of youth and haste. Hugs that didn't embrace, smiles that didn't reach their eyes, empty words that filled the silence without saying anything. The old woman felt a tightness in her chest, but pushed the feeling away. No, not today. Today was Christmas. Today was family. They sat at the table and ate quickly. The old woman asked about their lives, their work, their dreams, and they responded with monosyllables and glances at their cell phones. The old man tried to tell stories from when they were small, but no one listened. The laughs were mechanical. The atmosphere was strange, tense, as if everyone was there, fulfilling an obligation. The gift exchange was even worse. The grandchildren brought boxes wrapped in expensive paper, but when the old woman opened hers and saw the perfume, a generic, ordinary scent she would never use, something broke inside her. The old man received a tie. He hadn't worn a tie in 15 years, but they thanked them. They thanked them because it was what one did, because they still believed the gesture mattered more than the gift. The gifts they gave the grandchildren were different. She had spent months knitting that scarf for her youngest granddaughter, Anna, every stitch made with care, thinking of the city's cold, of the girl who always complained about having cold hands. He had restored an antique pocket watch for David, the eldest grandson who always wanted to be someone important, but when they opened them, the disappointment was clear. Anna shoved the scarf into her bag without even trying it on. David looked at the watch and forced a smile. "Cool, Grandpa, thanks," and put it in his pocket, like someone storing a useless trinket. The night wore on, and the festive spirit waned. Conversations became sparse. The silence weighed heavily. The old woman got up to get dessert, but when she returned, she felt something had changed. All 6 grandchildren were standing, forming a strange line in the living room. David was in front. He had that look she had never seen before. Cold, distant, determined. Her heart raced. The old man slowly rose, feeling the weight in the air. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. David took a deep breath. The others looked at the floor, and then he spoke, each word falling like a stone. "We need to tell you something." The old woman dropped the platter on the table, her hands trembling. The old man stepped forward, instinctively wanting to protect her from what was coming. But there was no protection, no way to stop it. "We won't be coming back here anymore," David said, his voice firm. "We're leaving. For good." The silence that fell in the room was so heavy it seemed to suck out the air. The old woman felt her legs weaken. The old man blinked, trying to process what he had heard. The other grandchildren remained silent, some looking away, others staring at the floor with guilt etched on their faces. "What do you mean?" The old woman's voice came out thin, broken. "That's it," David continued, emotionless. "We decided. It doesn't make sense to keep coming here. You don't need us, and we have our own lives. But it's Christmas," the old man managed to say, his voice almost gone. "It's family." "It was family," David corrected. "Now it's just an obligation." The word fell like a slap. The old woman put her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race, feeling the physical pain of it. The old man stood paralyzed, unable to react, unable to shout, unable to do anything but watch his grandchildren, the boys he raised, whom he loved, whom he taught to walk, turn and walk towards the door. There were no explanations, no goodbyes, just the sound of footsteps on the old floorboards, the creak of the door opening, the cold wind rushing in, and then they were gone. They vanished into the darkness of the night like ghosts, taking with them any illusion that they were still a family. The door slammed shut. The silence that remained was heavier than any scream. The old woman collapsed into a chair, her face hidden in her hands. The old man stood there, staring at the closed door, unable to move. The Christmas tree blinked behind them, indifferent. The food grew cold on the table. The candles extinguished one by one, and then he saw. On the coffee table, where the unwrapped presents had been, lay an envelope, brown, old, sealed with antique wax. No name, just a strange symbol he didn't recognize. The old man approached slowly, his hands trembling. He picked up the envelope. He felt its weight, its mystery, but he couldn't open it, not that night, not with the pain still fresh, still burning in his chest like live embers. He put the envelope back on the table and went to his wife. He knelt beside her, placed his hand on her shoulder. And they remained like that, in silence, as Christmas died. Around them, and the old house breathed along with their sorrow, a silent witness to an abandonment neither of them could comprehend. The days that followed were like walking through a thick fog. The house that once vibrated with the expectation of laughter and hugs now felt like a tomb. Every corner held a memory. The chair where the youngest grandson always sat, the window where the granddaughter liked to watch the snow, the back bedroom where they all slept when they were small. Everything there hurt. The old woman spent hours at the living room window, her gaze lost on the empty road. She waited. She didn't quite know what. Perhaps a car stopping, perhaps an apology, perhaps the revelation that it had all been a terrible mistake. But the days dragged on, and nothing changed. The road remained empty. The silence remained heavy. The pain remained alive. She wasn't eating properly. The old man tried to cook something in the kitchen, but he burned the rice, over-seasoned the meat, forgot the stove on. They sat at the table, too large for two people, and pushed the food around on their plates, neither of them brave enough to admit they couldn't swallow. At night, lying in the narrow bed where they had slept for decades, they lay awake in the dark. She cried softly, trying to muffle the sound with her pillow. He held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The pain was too great for words. The questions came non-stop, pounding in their heads, stealing their sleep. Where had they gone wrong? What had they done so terribly? Had they been too strict when they were children? Too lenient? Had they given less love than they should have? Had they given too much? Love and suffocated them. Memories paraded like an old film. First steps, birthday parties, sleepless nights when they were sick, the sacrifices made so they could study, have good clothes, have a future. The old man remembered selling the only valuable watch he owned to pay for David's school tuition. The old woman remembered sewing clothes late into the night to buy the Christmas presents they asked for. She remembered eating less so they could eat more. She remembered everything, and every memory was now a knife. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who lived 3 houses down, showed up with a comforting homemade cake and eyes full of pity. "I heard the kids didn't come for New Year's," she said awkwardly, leaving the cake on the table. "They must be working hard, right? Big city life." The old woman forced a smile and didn't correct her. It was easier to let the lie live, less painful than the truth. Mr. Peterson, the grocer, asked about the grandchildren when the old man went to buy bread. He changed the subject, mumbled something about modern life, and left quickly, feeling the weight of their gazes on his back. Small towns were like that. Everyone knew everything, and when they didn't, they invented it. Gossip spread like wildfire, and soon the story of the old couple abandoned by their grandchildren was on everyone's lips. Pity. That's what he saw in people's eyes, pity and morbid curiosity, and it was humiliating. The brown envelope remained on the coffee table, untouched. It was like a living presence in the room, a mystery they didn't dare unravel. The old woman looked at it sometimes, with a mixture of fear and anger. The old man avoided it, as if opening it could make everything even worse. But life didn't stop. Bills arrived, food ran out, their retirement money barely covered the basics, and now without the occasional help from the grandchildren, those $50 one or another sent for their birthday, the Christmas basket they sometimes brought, the situation began to tighten. The old woman looked at the nearly empty pantry and felt the weight of despair. It wasn't just the pain of rejection. It was the concrete reality of survival. How would they pay the overdue electricity bill? How would they buy the blood pressure medication that was running out? How would they fix the leaking roof in the bedroom? The old man saw the worry on her face and felt something else break inside his chest. He had failed as a grandfather, failed as a provider, failed as a man. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. It was on a rainy afternoon, exactly 24 hours after the most painful Christmas of their lives, that something changed. The old man was sitting in the armchair, staring at nothing, when his gaze fell upon the envelope. The rain pattered against the windows like sad music. The old woman was in the kitchen, trying to make the little rice that remained stretch further, and suddenly something inside him snapped. He had nothing left to lose. He rose slowly, picked up the envelope with hands that no longer trembled. Anger had dried up his fear. Despair had killed caution. He broke the antique wax seal with his finger, feeling the weight of that gesture. The old woman appeared at the kitchen door, a dishcloth in her hands, her eyes wide. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to find out," he said, his voice hard. "Whatever it is, I'm going to find out." He pulled the paper out. It wasn't a letter full of cruel words. It wasn't a testament of hate. It was a document, official, stamped, with the letterhead of a law firm. His heart raced. She approached, reading over his shoulder. The words danced on the page, difficult to process. Final disposition, conditions to be met, reward upon fulfillment, and an address in a nearby town, a lawyer's office. "What the devil is this?" the old woman whispered. The old man turned the page, looking for explanations, but there were none. Just the address, an appointment scheduled for 2 days later, and a final line that sent a chill down his spine. "Attend. Alone. There is something you need to know." They looked at each other, confusion, fear, and a tiny spark of something that might have been hope, or perhaps just desperate curiosity. That night, for the first time since Christmas, they truly talked, sitting at the kitchen table, the document between them, the dim light of the bulb casting shadows on their tired faces. "It could be a trick," she said. "It could be the kids trying to make fun of us." "It could," he agreed. "But what if it isn't? What if it's worse?" she countered. "What if it's, I don't know, a debt of theirs, something we'll have to pay?" The old man fell silent, thinking. He thought about the life they had led, the choices they had made, the sacrifices. He thought about the grandchildren they had raised, and who had abandoned them without explanation. He thought about the pain he carried in his chest, like a physical weight. "We've already lost everything," he said at last, his voice low but firm. "We're already at rock bottom. What more can happen?" The old woman looked at her husband and saw in him a determination she hadn't seen in a long time. She saw the man he had been before the pain, before the abandonment, before the weariness. And she felt something awaken within her too. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was more like a refusal to let herself be completely destroyed. "We're going," she said. "We're going to that lawyer and finding out what's going on." They spent the next 2 days in a strange mix of anxiety and apathy. They tidied up the least worn clothes they had. They took the money saved for emergencies, a ridiculous sum that would barely cover bus fare. They wrote down the address on a notepad. On the appointed morning, they left the house before sunrise. The bus to the nearby town passed early, and they couldn't miss it. The journey was silent. She held her old purse tightly on her lap. He looked out the window, watching the familiar landscape pass by, the fields, the scattered houses, the simple life they had always led. The nearby town was larger, busier. They felt small walking through the streets crowded with hurried people. Honking cars, tall buildings. The address led them to a commercial building downtown, all glass and concrete, imposing, intimidating. They rode up to the 5th floor in an elevator that smelled of expensive cleaning products. The hallway was carpeted in grey. The doors had polished metal plaques. Everything there screamed money, power, a world that wasn't theirs. They found the door. Dr. Henry Miller, Law and Estate Planning. The old man took a deep breath and knocked. A receptionist greeted them with a professional practice smile. She said they were expected. She asked them to wait. They sat. in leather chairs, out of place, feeling like intruders. 10 minutes that seemed like hours. And then the inner door opened. The lawyer was a man in his 50s, dark suit, thin glasses, serious expression. He quickly assessed them with his eyes and motioned for them to enter. The office was huge, bookshelves to the ceiling, a massive wooden desk, a window with a view of the city. "Please, have a seat," he said, his voice formal. They obeyed. The lawyer picked up a thick folder, opened it, scanned the documents. The silence stretched heavy. The old woman held her husband's hand under the table, her fingers cold. "Thank you for coming," the lawyer began, without taking his eyes off the papers. "I know this must be confusing, but I assure you everything will be clear soon." "Clear?" the old man blurted out, his voice harsher than he intended. "Nothing is clear. Our grandchildren abandoned us on Christmas, and now a mysterious envelope appears telling us to come here. Do you know what's going on?" The lawyer finally looked at them, and for the first time, something akin to compassion crossed that professional face. "I do," he said, "and I will explain, but I ask that you listen to me until the end, because the story is unusual." The lawyer opened the folder again and pulled out an old, faded photograph. He placed it on the table, facing them. The old woman pulled the photo closer, her eyes narrowing to see better. It was a middle-aged man, thin, with deep-set eyes and a strange smile. She didn't recognize him. "Do you know this man?" the lawyer asked. The old man took the photo, studied it. He turned to his wife and shook his head. She did the same. "No," he said. "Never seen him." "This is Arthur Evans," the lawyer explained, leaning back in his chair. "A distant great-uncle on your wife's maternal side. A distant cousin of her grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. He passed away 3 years ago." The old woman frowned, trying to recall. Vaguely, very vaguely, she remembered hearing of an Arthur. Someone the family hadn't seen, an eccentric relative who had left decades ago, but nothing more than that. A name, a shadow. "And what does this man have to do with us?" the old man asked, impatient. The lawyer put his fingertips together thoughtfully. "Arthur Evans was a visionary," he began, "or a madman, depending on your point of view. He made a fortune through risky investments, invention patents, unconventional businesses. He died alone, childless, wifeless, but he left a will, and quite a will it is." He pulled out another document, this one thicker, with several stapled pages. He handed it to them. The writing was tiny, cramped, difficult to read, clauses upon clauses, legal terms that made no sense. The old man tried to read, but gave up. The old woman quickly scanned it and felt her head spin. "What does this will say?" she asked, her voice thin. The lawyer took a deep breath. "It says that Arthur Evans's fortune, which is not small, I should warn you, would be divided among his closest living relatives, in this case you two, but with a condition." The word condition fell into the room like a bomb. The old man leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the lawyer. "What condition?" "That you be completely abandoned by your immediate offspring on an important holiday. Christmas, New Year's, Easter, a moment when the abandonment would be most painful, most significant, and that you spend at least 24 hours without any contact with them." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. The old woman felt her blood run cold in her veins. The old man blinked several times, trying to process what he had heard. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. "Are you saying that the kids knew?" the lawyer completed. "Yes, they knew. They were contacted by me 6 months ago. I explained the situation, the clause, the value of the inheritance, and they agreed to participate." The old woman brought her hand to her mouth. She felt nausea rising, the room spinning. The old man turned pale, then red, anger and confusion battling within him. "But why?" she managed to say. "Why would someone do something like that?" The lawyer picked up another sheet of paper, this one handwritten with the shaky script of someone writing in old age or illness. He left a letter explaining. "May I read it to you?" They nodded, mute. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. "If you are reading this, it is because my last will has been fulfilled. I know you will find me cruel, mad, perhaps monstrous, but I had my reasons. I lived my entire life alone because I chose to. I had no children because I didn't want them. I never married because love always seemed like a prison to me. I built my empire with my own hands, without help, without family, without anyone. And as I grew old, I realized something. People only value what they have when they lose it. They only understand the weight of a presence when it becomes an absence. You who are receiving this fortune, if indeed you are, have gone through the pain I wanted you to go through, the pain of abandonment, the pain of rejection, the pain of seeing those you love turn their backs. And if you have survived this, if you are still standing, then you deserve what I have left, because life is hard, and only the strong endure. Use the money wisely. Not to buy love back, that is impossible, but to live with dignity for the time you have left. And know that, in a strange way, I respect you, Arthur Evans." The lawyer slowly folded the paper and put it back in the folder. The old woman was crying, tears silently streaming down her wrinkled face. The old man gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "So it was all staged," he said, his voice hoarse. "The kids did this on purpose?" "Yes," the lawyer confirmed, "but not out of gratuitous cruelty. At least, that's not what they said when we spoke. They received a proposal. If they fulfilled the clause, each would receive a sum, not as large as yours, but substantial, enough to change their lives too." "How much?" the old man asked, his voice heavy with bitterness. "How much are we worth to them?" The lawyer hesitated, but he answered, $100,000 for each of them. The old woman let out a low moan. $600,000. That was the price of their abandonment. That was the value the grandchildren placed on their relationship. And suddenly everything made sense. The cold way they arrived, the hurried goodbyes in recent months, the gradual distancing. They were preparing themselves. They were hardening themselves to do what they needed to do. And us? The old man asked, his voice almost gone. "How much do we receive in this tasteless game?" The lawyer picked up another paper, this one with printed numbers, values, bank accounts. $12 million, he said, his voice neutral, worth approximately $65 million in today's market value, after all taxes and fees. The world stopped. The old woman felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The old man opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no sound came out. The numbers were too big, too impossible. They didn't make sense. They couldn't be real. 60, 65, she tried to say. Million, the lawyer completed. Yes, Arthur Evans was very wealthy and very specific. He wanted the money to go to people who proved resilience, who survived the test, and you survived. The old man suddenly stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He began to pace back and forth, his hands on his head, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The old woman remained seated, her face hidden in her hands, her body trembling. "It can't be true," he murmured. "It can't. None of this makes sense." "I understand the shock," the lawyer said, maintaining his professional calm, "and I know it's not easy to process, but I have all the documents here. I have bank statements, appraisals, certificates, everything authenticated and verified. The money exists, and it's yours, under one condition." "Another condition?" The old man stopped, looking at him with suspicion. "Simple," the lawyer said. "You cannot tell your grandchildren about the exact amount you received. Not yet. You need to go 6 months without contact. After that, the choice is yours. But during this period, the money will be deposited into an account in your names, and you can use it as you wish." The old woman lifted her face. Her eyes were red, but there was something new in them, something between anger and determination. "And if we refuse?" she asked. "Then the money goes to charity," the lawyer responded. "That's what Arthur stipulated. Either you accept or it all goes to institutions. The grandchildren receive nothing more either way. They've already been paid for the role they played." The old man sat back down. He looked at his wife. They communicated in silence, the way couples of decades can. There was pain there. There was betrayal, but there was also an opportunity, a chance to rewrite the end of the story. "We accept," the old man said, his voice firm for the first time since they had entered that office. The lawyer nodded and began pulling out documents. There were forms to sign, authentications to make, banking information to fill out. They spent the next hour in a bureaucratic fog, signing where they were told, listening to technical explanations they barely understood. When everything was done, the lawyer stood up and extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said, and for the first time he sounded sincere. "And I am sorry for what you've been through, for the test, for everything." They shook his hand and left. The hallway seemed longer on the way back, the elevator slower, the street noisier. They walked to the nearest park and sat on a wooden bench, side by side, in absolute silence. The sun was already beginning to set. People rushed past, living their normal lives, unaware that there, on that bench, two old people had just had their lives turned upside down. "We're rich," the old woman said, and the phrase sounded absurd coming from her mouth. "We are," the old man agreed. "But at what price?" He didn't answer, because there was no answer. The money was real. The pain was too, and now they would have to learn to live with both. The journey back was different from the trip there. They sat on the bus, side by side as always, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of pain, but a kind of suspension, as if they were floating between two realities, the old one, where they were just two abandoned poor old people, and the new one, where they had more money than they could imagine, but carried a truth that burned. The old man looked out the window without seeing anything. His head spun with questions that had no easy answers. The grandchildren had done it for money. Just money. $100,000 each. And for that amount, they had agreed to break their grandparents' hearts, to feign coldness, to execute a calculated abandonment. The resentment was a living thing inside him, growing, feeding on every memory. The old woman held her purse in her lap, her fingers gripping the worn fabric. $65 million. The number was too big, too abstract. She tried to imagine what to do with so much money, but her mind, it couldn't process it. Buy a new house, travel, help someone. But none of that mattered if the wound in her chest didn't heal. When they arrived home, it was already night. The old house greeted them with the familiar creak of the floorboards, the smell of mildew and stale food. Everything exactly as they had left it, but they were no longer the same. The old man turned on the kitchen light. The old woman took off her coat and hung it on the crooked hanger near the door. Automatic, mechanical movements. Neither of them knew what to say. The weight of the truth was there between them, enormous and inescapable. "Are you hungry?" she asked, just to ask. "No." "Me neither." They sat at the table. They stayed there, looking at their hands, at the old wood full of marks and stories. The clock on the wall marked time with its irritating tick-tock. Even that sound, which had always been part of the house, now seemed different. Everything seemed different. "We should be happy," the old woman said at last, her voice low. "Rich overnight. It was supposed to be a miracle." "But it doesn't feel like it," the old man completed. "No, it doesn't." She got up and went to the window. She looked at the empty street, at the few lights in the neighboring houses. The simple life they had always known. The life that suddenly could be completely different. They knew, she said without turning. The whole time they knew. When they came here, when they smiled, when we gave them presents, they already knew they were going to do this. The old man closed his eyes. Anger came in waves, mixed with a sadness so deep it hurt physically. For 100,000, he said, his voice laden with bitterness. 100,000 for each of them. That's what we're worth. No, she turned, her eyes shining. It's not. We're worth much more than that. And if they didn't see it, that's their problem. It was the first time since Christmas that she spoke with firmness. The old man looked at his wife and saw in her a strength he hadn't expected. 52 years together. He knew every wrinkle on that face, every gesture, every silence. And in that moment, he saw in her the strong girl who had married him when they had nothing but dreams. "What do we do now?" he asked. She returned to the table, sat down, took his hands in hers. "We live," she said. "We use this money to live, truly live, not for them, not because of them, for us." In the days that followed, life began to change in strange ways. The lawyer had been efficient. The bank account was opened. The money was deposited. They received cards, passwords, instructions. Suddenly, they had access to an amount that seemed unreal. The old man's first instinct was not to touch it, to leave the money there untouched, as if it were a trap. But the old woman was more practical. The electricity bill needed to be paid. The medication was running out. The roof leaked more and more. "We start slowly," she said. "Fix what needs to be fixed. Buy what needs to be bought. Nothing extravagant, just dignity." And that's what they did. They called Mr. Mark, the old carpenter from town, to fix the roof. He came with his son, and in 2 days the house was secure again. The old man paid him in cash, and the feeling of being able to do that without worrying was strange and liberating at the same time. The old woman went to Mr. Peterson's grocery store and filled her cart. She bought real meat, fresh fruit, vegetables, chocolate, things she hadn't bought in years. Mr. Peterson looked surprised at all the groceries but didn't ask. He just smiled and said it was good to see her eating right. They replaced the old mattresses with new ones. They bought clothes that weren't torn or stained. They fixed the television that had been broken for months. Small things, simple things, but each of them brought a little bit of dignity back. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor, noticed the changes. She appeared one afternoon with the excuse of asking for sugar, but her eyes scanned everything: the new roof, the clothes on the line, the working television. "It's good that things have improved," she said, curious. "Did the kids send money?" The old woman smiled but didn't answer directly. "Life has its ups and downs," was all she said, and Mrs. Henderson had to be content with that. But not everything was simple. At night, lying in the new bed that still smelled of the store, they still felt the emptiness. Money bought comfort, but it didn't heal wounds. It didn't bring the grandchildren back. It didn't erase the words spoken that Christmas. It didn't turn betrayal into loyalty. "Do you think they know?" the old woman asked one night in the dark. "Do you think they know we found out?" "No," the old man said. "The lawyer said he couldn't tell them." "But what about 6 months from now, when we can talk?" He fell silent. That was the question that wouldn't leave his head either. What would happen when the deadline ended? Would they seek out the grandchildren? Would they tell them everything? Would they forgive? Would they demand something? Would they simply cut off contact forever? "I don't know," he admitted. "I really don't know." Weeks passed. Winter slowly gave way to a timid spring. The old house, now renovated, seemed more welcoming. They bought paint and painted the walls. They replaced the old curtains. They planted flowers in the garden that had been abandoned for years. Each improvement was a small act of rebellion against the pain. Each change was a way of saying, "You didn't destroy us, you didn't win." One day, the old man was in the garden, tending the soil, when he heard the gate creak. He looked up and saw Mrs. Henderson with a bag in her hand, but she wasn't alone. Beside her, with an embarrassed expression, stood Gerald's father, their only son, who had died young in a car accident, leaving his 6 children orphaned to be raised by their grandparents. No, wait, it wasn't Gerald. He had been dead for 15 years. The old man blinked, confused. Was he seeing things? But then the figure spoke, and the voice was young, nervous. "Grandpa." His heart stopped. It was David, the eldest grandson, the one who had spoken the words that Christmas, the one who had closed the door and disappeared into the darkness. The old woman appeared at the door of the house, drying her hands on her apron. She saw her grandson standing there, pale, with a bag in his hands, and felt the world spin again. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice coming out harsher than she intended. The grandson swallowed hard. Mrs. Henderson patted his arm and moved away, leaving them alone. Her cowardice was obvious. She had brought the boy here but didn't want to stay for the scene. I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't have come, that I have no right, but—" "But what?" the old man interrupted, anger returning hot and fast. "But you felt guilty? But the money wasn't enough?" The grandson looked up, confused. "Money? What money?" And in that moment, the old man realized the mistake. The grandson didn't know they had found out, didn't know the lawyer had told them everything. He thought they still believed the abandonment had been real, definitive, without explanation. The old woman approached slowly. She looked at her grandson, the boy she had helped raise after her son died, the boy she had taught to walk, to read, to be a man, and felt anger and love warring within her chest. "Why did you come?" she asked more gently. The grandson took a deep breath. He opened the bag and took out a wrapped item. It was the watch, the pocket watch his grandfather had restored and given him for Christmas. "I couldn't," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried, but I couldn't. Stay. Away. Pretend you don't exist. Accept that I did what I did." Tears began to stream down his face. The old man felt something stir within his chest, something between anger and compassion. The old woman brought her hand to her face, her own eyes filling. "I'm so sorry," the grandson said, and now he was truly crying, his body trembling. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have accepted. But the money, we needed it so badly, and it seemed so easy. And I... He broke down. He fell to his knees right there. In front of them, the watch still in his hand, sobbing like a child. And in that moment, the old man understood something. The test hadn't just been for them. It had been for the grandchildren too. And this one, at least, had failed. It had broken under the weight of guilt. The old woman looked at her husband, and slowly, without words, the two approached. They knelt beside their grandson, and they embraced him. They stayed there, the 3 of them kneeling in the freshly tended garden, while their grandson cried and begged for forgiveness in disjointed, meaningless, desperate words. The old woman stroked his back, an automatic gesture of comfort that came from years of raising that boy. The old man just held him, firm, feeling his grandson's body tremble against his. When the crying subsided, when only spaced sobs and heavy breaths remained, they slowly separated. The grandson wiped his face with the back of his hand, ashamed. He looked at his grandparents and saw in them something he didn't expect. Not anger, not rejection, but a deep sadness that was worse than any shout. "Come inside," the old woman said, her voice soft. "Let's talk properly." They entered the house. The grandson looked around and noticed the changes. The new roof, the painted walls, the furniture that hadn't been there before. He frowned, confused, but didn't ask. He had no right to ask. They sat at the kitchen table. The old woman made coffee, the familiar ritual she always performed when they had visitors. The aroma filled the kitchen, bringing a sense of normalcy amidst the emotional chaos. She served 3 cups, placed the sugar bowl in the center, and sat down. The silence stretched. No one knew where to begin. The grandson stirred his coffee without drinking. The old man looked at his own hands. The old woman waited, patient, because she knew that sometimes silence spoke more than words. "How did you manage," the grandson finally asked, "to fix the house, buy new things? You always had so little." The old woman and the old man exchanged glances. The truth was right there, on the tip of their tongues. But the agreement was clear: 6 months without telling. 4 more months remained. And despite the anger, despite the hurt, they wouldn't break their promise. "We found a way," the old woman said vaguely. "Life sometimes surprises you." The grandson looked at her, searching for a lie, but found none. Only weariness, only sadness. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness," he began again, the words coming out slowly, heavily. "I know what we did was unforgivable. But I need you to know it wasn't easy. It wasn't." "But you did it," the old man said, and there was steel in his voice. "You planned it. You all 6 agreed. You came here, smiling, pretending, and then you just left. On Christmas. You abandoned us on Christmas." "I know," the grandson lowered his head. "And there's no excuse, but I want to explain, not to justify, because there is no justification, just for you to understand." "Then explain," the old woman said. The grandson took a deep breath. The words came out difficult, broken. "A lawyer contacted us, said there was an inheritance, a great-uncle no one knew. Said we could receive a lot of money if we met a specific condition. We thought it was crazy at first, but he showed us documents, proved it was real. And the amount, it was a lot of money, for each of us." He paused, swallowed hard. "I was drowning in debt. I lost my job 6 months ago. Anna is pregnant and doesn't have health insurance. Michael needs knee surgery. Julia's store is going bankrupt. Peter and Carly, everyone needed it. And suddenly there was this chance, this way out." "And was it worth it?" the old man asked, his voice cutting. "Was betraying us worth it?" The grandson looked up, and his eyes were red, swollen. "No," he said firmly. "It wasn't. I thought it would be worth it, that money would solve everything, that we would be able to move on. But I can't sleep. Every night I see your faces when we left, the pain, the confusion, and the money. The money is useless when you hate yourself." The old woman felt something tighten in her chest. She looked at her grandson, at the man he had become, at the worry lines on his still young face, at the weight he carried, and saw in him the boy he had been, the boy who woke up in the middle of the night crying for his dead father, the boy she cradled in her arms until he fell asleep again. "And the others?" she asked. "The other 5, do they feel this way too?" The grandson shook his head. "I don't know. We kind of drifted apart after that. Everyone took their money and disappeared. I guess no one wants to face what we did. It's easier to pretend it didn't happen." "But it did happen," the old man said. "I know. And there's no going back, no undoing it. But I can't carry this alone anymore. I needed to come. I needed to look at you and say, I messed up. I messed up badly. And if you never want to see me again, I'll understand, but I had to try." The silence returned, heavy, laden. The coffee grew cold in the untouched cups. Outside, the wind rustled the new flowers in the garden. Life went on, indifferent to the human drama inside that kitchen. The old woman was the one who broke the silence. "Do you remember when you were little?" she asked, her voice soft. "When your father died and you came to live with us?" The grandson nodded without speaking. You had nightmares, every night. Woke up screaming. And I would go there, pick you up, even though you were already big, and stay with you until you fell asleep again. Remember? I remember, he whispered. I did that because I loved you, because you were my grandson, because that's what family is. You care, even when you're tired, even when it hurts, even when you have nothing to give but your presence. Tears streamed down his face again. And you never abandoned us, he said, his voice breaking. Never. Even when you had no money, even when it was difficult, you were always there, and we did the opposite. You did, the old man agreed sternly, and it hurts. It hurts because we gave everything we had. It wasn't much, but it was everything, and you threw it away for money. I know. The grandson covered his face with his hands. I know. The old woman got up, went to him, placed her hand on his shoulder. The grandson looked up, his eyes pleading for something. Forgiveness, understanding, anything to ease the burden. It will take time, she said honestly. I won't lie to you. We won't forget. And I don't know if we'll completely forgive, but you came. You admitted it. You didn't run away, and that's a start. The grandson suddenly stood up and hugged her. He hugged her tightly, desperately, like someone clinging to a life raft. She let him. She let him cry on her shoulder, let him unburden years of pain and guilt he had carried alone. The old man watched, rigid. The anger was still there, alive. But beside it, slowly growing, was something else. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was more like understanding. The understanding that his grandson had been tested too, and that in some strange way they were all victims of that crazy old man and his cruel will. When the grandson calmed down, when he could breathe properly again, they sat back down. This time the atmosphere was different, still heavy, but not as suffocating. And now, the grandson asked. Now you go back to your life, the old man said, and we continue with ours. And in a while, we'll see what happens. Can I come back? He asked, hesitantly. Once in a while? The old woman looked at her husband. He took a deep breath and nodded minimally. You can, she said, but slowly and with truth. No pretense, no obligation. Either it's real or it's nothing. It will be real, he promised, I swear. He stayed a little longer. He helped the old woman wash the dishes. He talked to the old man about the garden, about the flowers, about small, unimportant things that paradoxically were the most important. When the sun began to set, he said goodbye. He hugged them both again, calmer, and left. They stood at the door, watching him disappear around the bend in the road. The old woman sighed deeply. The old man put his arm around her shoulders. Did we do the right thing? She asked. I don't know, he replied honestly. But we did what we had to do, and that will have to be enough. That night, lying in the new bed, they talked for the first time about the future, about what they would do with the money, about what life would be like from now on, about the other 5 grandchildren who hadn't appeared yet, about forgiveness, about justice, about second chances. Do you think the others will come too? She asked. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe only this one has a conscience. And if they come, we'll decide then, one at a time. She agreed. It was fair. It was the most they could promise. Sometimes I think about that old man, she said. Arthur, what do you think went through his head to create something like this? I think he was lonely, the old man said thoughtfully, and he wanted to prove something. To himself, I don't know. That people are driven by money, maybe. And are they? She asked. Some are, but not all. The boy came back. Even knowing it would be painful, that it would be humiliating, he came back. So maybe the old man was wrong. Or maybe he was proving something else, she suggested, that people make mistakes but they can come back, that nothing is definitive, that there's always a choice. The old man thought about it. It made sense. In a strange, cruel, tortuous way, it made sense. 4 months, he said. 4 months left until we can tell them everything. What do we do until then? We live, she answered, echoing the words she had said before. We truly live. We use this money to have dignity, to have comfort, to have peace. And when the time comes, we'll decide what to do with the truth. And if the others come back before then, we'll welcome them, listen, and decide. Each case is different. Each heart is different. He squeezed her hand in the dark. 52 years. Half a century together. They had survived poverty, the death of their son, raising 6 grandchildren, abandonment, the revelation. And now they were surviving wealth too, because that was the truth that old Arthur perhaps hadn't understood. Money changes life, but it doesn't change character. It doesn't create love where it doesn't exist. It doesn't heal wounds just because it exists. It's just a tool, and like any tool, it depends on who uses it and how they use it. We're going to be okay, the old woman said, more to herself than to him. We are, he agreed. And they believed. Because that's what they had learned their entire lives, to believe, even when it was difficult, even when it hurt, even when everything indicated otherwise. Believing was what kept them alive. Believing was what kept them human. And perhaps, in the end, that was what truly mattered. The following months were a period of slow reconstruction. The old house gained new life, but not ostentation. They replaced what needed replacing, fixed what needed fixing, but kept the essence of the place that had always been theirs. The old rocking chair on the porch, the wooden table where so many meals had been shared, the photographs on the walls, witnesses to a family that was once whole. The eldest grandson, David, came back 3 times, always with prior notice, always respectful, always carrying that visible weight of guilt and hope. The first time he stayed only an hour. They talked about simple things, the weather, the garden, news from town. The second he brought his pregnant wife. The old woman held the young woman's hands and felt the life growing within her and cried, because life always conquered death, always conquered pain. The third time he stayed for lunch. And when he left, he hugged his grandparents with less desperation and more genuine affection. The other 5 grandchildren did not appear. Their silence was a constant presence, an unanswered question. Where were they? How were they living with what they had done? Could they sleep, or were they like the other 4, fleeing guilt, burying it under layers of justifications and forced forgetfulness? The old woman thought about them every night before falling asleep. The old man didn't talk about them, but she knew he thought about them too. How could he not? They were their flesh and blood, pieces of a story that could not be erased, no matter how much it hurt. One day, when they were already entering the 3rd month after the discovery of the inheritance, Mrs. Henderson appeared again. This time, not with gossip, but with news. Julia's doing really badly, she said, without mincing words. Your granddaughter, the one with the shop. I heard the shop went completely under, that she's neck-deep in debt, that... She stopped, realizing she might be too intrusive. Sorry, none of my business. But it was. In some strange way, it was. The old woman thanked her for the information and closed the door. She stood there, her hand still on the doorknob, her heart aching. Julia, the girl who loved to read, the girl who dreamed of having her own bookstore, the girl who had managed with great effort to open that small but dream-filled space. And now everything was falling apart. We can't do anything, the old man said, guessing her thoughts. "The agreement is clear. We can't tell them about the money. And if we help without explaining, she'll get suspicious," the old woman completed. "Or worse, she'll feel even more guilty." "Yeah," he agreed, but his voice came out heavy. That night, neither of them could sleep properly. The wealth they now had seemed like a cruel joke. They could help, they could save their granddaughter's shop, they could lift the weight from her shoulders, but they couldn't, not yet. 3 months remained. 3 months, that could be. The difference between survival and complete ruin. It was the old man who had the idea. "What if we help in another way?" he said in the morning, while they were having coffee. "Not with direct money, but with, I don't know, an anonymous loan. Or a donation from a mystery benefactor," the old woman thought. It was risky, it could go wrong. But it was better than doing nothing and watching their granddaughter sink. "I'll talk to the lawyer," she decided. "See if there's a way to do it without breaking the agreement." 2 weeks later, Julia's shop received an envelope. Inside, a check for an amount sufficient to pay off the most urgent debts, accompanied by a simple letter from someone who believes in dreams. Don't give up. They never knew if she suspected the source, but the shop didn't close, and that, in some way, helped the old woman sleep better. Time passed. Slowly, as time always does when you're waiting, but it passed. And finally, the day arrived. 6 months after that Christmas, 6 months after the abandonment, 6 months after the truth was revealed, the lawyer called personally. "The deadline is up," he said. "From now on, you are free to tell whatever you want to whoever you want, but reflect first. Some truths liberate, others destroy." The old woman thanked him and hung up. She looked at her husband. He was sitting in the armchair, the newspaper forgotten on his lap, his eyes fixed on some invisible point. "And now?" she asked. "Now we decide," he answered. But deciding wasn't easy. They spent days talking, weighing, measuring every possibility. Tell everything? Tell part? Tell nothing? Call the grandchildren? Wait for them to come? And what to say? How to say it? In the end, it was the old woman who found the way. "We'll gather them," she said. "All 6 of them, not here, somewhere neutral, and we'll tell them everything, without anger, without accusation, just the truth, and then we'll let them decide what they're going to do with it. And if they don't come? If they don't come, at least we tried, and we'll have peace knowing we did the right thing." They sent the letters, 6 identical letters, handwritten by the old woman, with trembling but firm handwriting. "We need to talk, it's important. It's not about anger, it's about truth. Please come." And an address, the old church hall, the place where they had married decades ago, where they had baptized their grandchildren, where the family had lived so many moments. Of the 6, 5 confirmed. Julia was the first. She said she would be there, that she owed it to her grandparents. David confirmed with an "I'll be there, Grandma." Peter and Carly, the twins, responded together, a single yes that carried guilt. Michael, the one who needed surgery, took a while but confirmed. Only Anna didn't respond. The youngest, the one who had always been more distant. Her silence hurt, but it wasn't a surprise. The appointed day dawned cloudy. The wind blew cold, bringing the smell of rain. The old woman wore the blue dress she saved for special occasions. The old man put on the suit he hadn't worn in years. They looked at each other in the mirror and saw 2 people who had traversed hell and survived. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," she replied honestly. "But we're going anyway." They arrived early at the hall. The place was empty, silent, full of memories. The old man arranged the chairs in a circle. The old woman placed water and glasses on a small side table, small practical gestures that helped calm their anxiety. The grandchildren arrived one by one. Julia, pale but present. The twins, nervous. Michael, limping slightly. David, with red eyes like someone who hadn't slept well. Each one entered, greeted with nods or uncomfortable hugs, and sat down. Anna didn't come. When it became clear she wouldn't come, the old man closed the door. He sat beside his wife, facing the 5 grandchildren. The silence was dense, heavy with anticipation and fear. "Thank you for coming," the old woman began, her voice calm. "I know it wasn't easy, and I know what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to process." The grandchildren looked at each other. David leaned forward, attentive, and then she told them everything. From the mysterious envelope to the visit to the lawyer. From the discovery of the will to the absurd value of the inheritance. From the pain of knowing they had been betrayed to the slow understanding that they were all pieces of a larger game. She told it without anger, without accusation, just the naked, raw, inescapable truth. When she finished, the silence that fell was absolute. Julia had her hands on her face, crying silently. Michael stared at the floor, his face ashen. The twins held hands, pale. David was paralyzed, his eyes wide, processing. $65 million, he repeated, his voice empty. "You have $65 million. "We do," the old man confirmed. "Because we survived that crazy old man's test. Because we endured the pain. Because we didn't give up." "And you knew?" Julia asked, her voice breaking. "You knew how long?" "Since the day after Christmas," the old woman answered. "We found out 24 hours after you left." "And you didn't tell us anything," Michael said, more to himself. "You knew for 6 months and didn't say anything." "We couldn't," the old man explained. "It was part of the agreement. 6 months of silence. And besides, we didn't know if you deserved to know." The sentence fell like a stone. The grandchildren lowered their heads, ashamed, guilty, devastated. "We don't deserve it," David said, his voice hoarse. "We don't deserve anything from you. We did a horrible thing, for money, for a miserable $100,000 that was worth nothing compared to what we lost." "And what did you lose?" the old woman asked, genuinely curious. "You," he replied, looking up. "We lost you, the only thing that truly mattered, and we didn't even realize it until it was too late." Julia suddenly stood up. "It was you," she said, looking at her grandmother. "The mystery benefactor, it was you who saved my shop." The old woman neither confirmed nor denied. She just looked, and Julia broke down. She fell to her knees right there on the cold church hall floor and cried as she hadn't cried since she was a child. The old woman went to her, knelt down too, and hugged her. The other grandchildren approached, and suddenly they were all there, in a tight circle, crying together, asking for forgiveness together, bleeding together. The old man stood, watching, and for the first time in 6 months he felt something that wasn't pain. It wasn't exactly joy. It was more like relief, the relief of letting go, of forgiving not because they deserved it, but because he deserved it. He deserved peace. He deserved to move on. When they separated, when they could speak again, the questions came. What happens now? And the money? And the family? And the future? "The money is ours," the old man said firmly, "and we will use it as we wish. But it won't be to buy your love back, if that's what you're thinking." "We don't want the money," David said, and he seemed honest. "Never again. We just want a chance. To come back. To make things right. To be a real family." The old woman looked at each of the faces there. Still young, but marked by the choice they made, by the weight they carried. "Family isn't bought," she said. "It's not won in a day. It's built, slowly, with truth and presence, and it only happens if everyone wants it, if everyone commits." "We want to," Julia said. "We want to," the twins repeated. "We want to," Michael confirmed. "We want to," David finished. And in that moment something changed. It wasn't complete forgiveness, it wasn't forgetting, but it was a beginning. A real, painful, imperfect beginning. The months following that meeting in the church hall were a time of rebuilding, not the quick, easy rebuilding of movies, where a hug solves everything and happy music plays in the background, but real, slow rebuilding, full of stumbles and fresh starts, of steps forward and some backward, of difficult conversations and even more difficult silences. David, the eldest grandson, returned every week. At first, he stayed only half an hour. An hour. Superficial conversations about the weather, his wife's pregnancy, nothing too deep. But little by little, the layers began to peel away. He talked about sleepless nights, about the weight of guilt, about how the money he had received felt dirty, stained with blood. And his grandparents listened. They just listened, because sometimes that's what people need. Not advice, not judgment, just someone to truly hear them. Julia appeared with the excuse of bringing books for her grandmother, books she knew the old woman would enjoy reading, and she would stay for coffee. And coffee would turn into lunch, and lunch would turn into conversation until the sun set. She never directly mentioned the shop again, the mysterious check, the salvation that had come from somewhere. But every time she looked at her grandmother, there was a sparkle in her eyes that said, "I know, and thank you." Michael was the most difficult. He appeared once, twice, but always tense, always with that rigidity of someone unsure how to act. The knee surgery had been done, with the money he received probably, but the recovery was slow, painful, and the physical pain seemed less than the emotional. It was on a Sunday afternoon, when he was helping his grandfather fix the garden fence, that he finally opened up. "I always thought we weren't important to you," he said, without looking. "I always thought you did it out of obligation, because Dad died, and there was no other way. I never thought it was real love." The old man stopped hammering. He looked at his grandson, at that young man with the eyes of the son he had lost. "And now?" he asked. "What do you think now?" Michael finally looked at him, and there were tears there. "I think I was an idiot," he said, his voice breaking. "I think you gave everything you had, and then some, and I was too blind to see it." The old man placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder. He squeezed. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that gesture didn't already convey. The twins, Peter and Carly, always came together. They had been inseparable since birth, and they shared the weight of guilt equally. They brought food, helped around the house, tried in every possible way to compensate for what they had done. The old woman had to tell them 3 times until they understood. It wasn't about compensation. It was about presence. It was about truth. It was about being there because they wanted to be, not because they felt obligated. Only Anna remained absent. Her silence was an open wound that wouldn't heal. Her siblings tried to contact her, convince her to come, but she always refused. She said she wasn't ready, that maybe she never would be, that some mistakes were too big to be forgiven. One spring afternoon, when the garden flowers were all in bloom and the air smelled of new beginnings, the 5 grandchildren who had returned organized a surprise. They invited their grandparents to a special lunch. They didn't say where. They just asked them to trust. The old man and old woman went, skeptical but curious. David's car picked them up and took them to his house, a simple but cozy house on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, they saw the table set in the garden, full of food with flowers in the center and a cake with candles. "It's no one's birthday," the old woman said, confused. "Yes, it is," Julia replied, smiling. "It's our family's birthday, the day we became a family again." The lunch was noisy, joyful, full of laughter and stories. The children, the great-grandchildren who were being born, ran through the garden. David's pregnant wife rested in the shade, her belly already huge. And there, surrounded by that new life sprouting, the grandparents felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst was behind them. Hope that old Arthur's cruel test had, in some twisted way, served to teach something. That money passes, that pain heals, but that family, real family, built with choice and presence, remains. But not everything was roses and happy endings. A week later, on a cold morning, there was a knock at the door. The old man opened it and found Anna standing there, with a suitcase in her hand and red eyes. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He stepped aside, letting her pass. The old woman appeared in the living room and stopped, surprised. The two looked at each other in silence, and then, without words, the granddaughter broke down. She fell right there on the floor and cried as she hadn't cried since childhood. The old woman went to her. She sat on the floor, too, pulled her granddaughter into her lap, even though she was an adult, even though she was heavy, and cradled her, the way she used to do when she was small. And Anna cried everything. The guilt, the shame, the fear of not being forgiven, the pain of having run away while her siblings returned. "I thought I could forget," she said between sobs. "I thought if I disappeared, if I didn't look, it would hurt less. But it hurt more. It hurt so much I couldn't live right anymore." "You're here now," the old woman whispered. "That's what matters. You're here now." And it was true. Anna stayed. It wasn't easy. Her siblings were still hurt with her for having taken so long. She still carried more guilt than all of them combined. But she stayed, and slowly, very slowly, she began to heal. 2. Life gradually returned to normal, or rather it found a new normal. Sundays became family days. Sometimes at the grandparents' house, sometimes at one of the grandchildren's houses. The children grew up hearing stories from their great-grandparents. The money, that absurd amount of money, was used with wisdom and discretion. They completely renovated the house but maintained its essence. They helped the grandchildren when necessary, but without excess. They donated to charities. They helped neighbors in difficulty. They traveled a little, not extensively, because deep down they were simple people who loved their home. And they saved. They saved for the great-grandchildren, for the future, for everyone's security. But most importantly, they learned that money doesn't buy love, doesn't erase pain, doesn't fix everything. But it can, if used wisely, provide dignity. It can give choices. It can give time. And time, in the end, was the most precious commodity. 1 year after that fateful Christmas, they were all gathered again. All 6 grandchildren, now with children of their own. The house was full, noisy, alive. And when it was time to light the Christmas tree, because yes, they made sure to celebrate again, to give new meaning to that date, the old man asked for silence. "A year ago, on this very day, you left," he said, his voice firm, "and we thought everything was over, that the family had died. But it didn't. Family doesn't die easily. It gets hurt, it breaks, it bleeds. But if there's a will to fix it, if there's truth and presence, it comes back. Different, but it comes back." He looked at each of the faces there, faces he loved, that had hurt him, that had returned. "This money we received was the result of a cruel test. From an old man who thought money was the answer to everything. But he was wrong. Money is a tool. Love is the answer. And today, a year later, we are here, together, and that is worth more than any fortune." The grandchildren cried. The old woman cried. Even the children, not fully understanding, fell quiet, feeling the weight of that moment. And when they lit the tree, when the tiny lights began to blink just as they had a year ago, there was no more pain in that glow. There was hope. There was a new beginning. There was family. Later, when everyone had left and the house returned to silence, the old man and old woman sat on the porch. The night was starry, cold, beautiful. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her shoulders. "We made it," she said. "We did," he agreed. "Was it worth it, the pain, the test, everything?" He thought. He really thought about the pain of that Christmas, about the discovery of the will, about the months of rebuilding, about the grandchildren who returned, each in their own way, about the family that almost died but survived. "I don't know if it was worth it," he replied honestly, "but we survived, and in the end, I think that's what matters. We survived, and we are still capable of loving, still capable of forgiving, still capable of believing, and if we haven't lost that, then we've gained everything." She smiled, squeezed his hand, and they stayed there beneath the stars, two old people who had traversed hell and returned hand in hand, two old people who had learned that the true test was not of survival or pain, it was of humanity, the ability to continue being human even when everything conspired against it, to continue loving even when love had been used as a weapon. They had passed, all of them had passed, and now, finally, they could live, truly live, with dignity, with affection, with peace. The wind blew softly, bringing the scent of flowers and the promise of better days. The old house breathed along with them, a faithful witness to a story that began with abandonment and ended with reunion. Of a family that broke and rebuilt itself, of a love that was tested and proved stronger than any money, stronger than any pain. And when they closed the door and turned off the lights, when the night finally enveloped everything in silence and darkness, the last thing heard was the old woman's soft laugh and the old man's hoarse voice saying, "Tomorrow we'll plant more flowers in the garden." "Tomorrow," she agreed, because there was always a tomorrow, there was always hope, there was always a new beginning, there was always life. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.